The Mystery at Cabin Island, Chapter 12, An Ice Boat Clue. Now, you remember the boys found a notebook, and at the very end, there was that long string of letters that I read to you. It's a coded message, all right, Joe declared as the four boys continued to stare at the mysterious letters in the tattered notebook. How will we ever figure it out? Chet asked. Well, there are several methods of deciphering, Frank replied. Dad has told Joe and me something about it, and we've read a few his books on cryptography. Can you make anything out of this message? Biff asked. Not right off, Frank replied. It's some kind of substitution system at any rate. The first thing to look for is transposition, Joe explained. All the letters of the actual text, what's really meant, may be present, but reversed or scrambled. There must be countless possibilities, remarked Biff, once you start putting one letter in place of another. Yes, which makes deciphering very difficult, Frank agreed, but I remember several of the standard patterns. I'll use some of the blank pages in the notebook and try them. Frank worked for more than half an hour while the others looked on and made various combinations of the letters he jotted down. I'm stymied, Frank admitted finally. Biff frowned. How did Hanley get hold of this notebook? Does he know Sparewell? Hanley must have swiped it, Joe said. The Hardys pondered their next move. Joe suggested they take the iceboat model and the photo of the turbine prowler to Mr. Jefferson for possible identification. And on the way, show Amos Grice the picture, too, Frank added. A stop at the Hardy home also was included in the day's plans in case the boy's father had any more information on the alley cat. Chet heaved a huge sigh, which means Biff and I stand guard here. Joe grinned. How did you guess? After a quick lunch, the Hardys put on their parkas and boots. I'm taking the camera along, Joe said. It may come in handy again. The Hardys climbed into the Seagull and headed for Surfside. At the dock, Joe tied up while Frank braked and slackened sail. Then they strode off to the general store. Amos Grice, seated by the stove, slapped his knee when Joe and Frank walked in. Glad to see you two. Did he steal your food again? No, sir, Frank said. We came to show you this. He handed the snapshot to Mr. Grice. The storekeeper stared at it, then handed the picture back without comment. Mr. Grice, Joe inquired, is this the man who asked you about Mr. Jefferson's medals? Amos Grice drew his lips into a thin, firm line. Yep, it's him, but there's some spooky business going on, and I don't want any part of it. Did this man say something to frighten you? Joe persisted. Did he threaten you? Mr. Grice looked grim. No, but I'm not mixing in with any scary masqueraders. The Hardys could see that the storekeeper would say no more on the subject. They thanked him and returned to the Seagull. A brisk wind spread them toward Bayport. They tied up outside their boathouse and drove home. Mrs. Hardy greeted her red-cheeked sons with big hugs, while Aunt Gertrude looked on apprehensively, as if trying to find something wrong with her nephews. Noting their excellent health, she returned her worries to their companions. Has something terrible happened to Chet or Biff? No. Why, Auntie? Joe asked. That sudden snowstorm. I was scared stiff for you boys. Some trees blew down over here. Frank grinned. We weathered it, howling banshee and all. A what? Mrs. Hardy asked, and her sons told of the whistling bottle. Well, I'm relieved to know that's all the trouble you ran into, Mrs. Hardy said. Oh, there was more, Joe said. By the way, where's Dad? Out of town, but he left a message. It's in a sealed envelope on his desk. Frank and Joe hastened to their father's study, found the envelope addressed to them, and tore it open. Inside was a terse note telling his son that fingerprints found by the police in Mr. Jefferson's ransacked house were those of Hanley. They had been identified by the FBI in Washington, where the federal agency had a record of interstate frauds involving Hanley several years before. Local police were now looking for him. Ah, con man, we might have known, mumbled Joe. The message went on to warn the boys again to be cautious and ended. Just as in fishing through the ice, you have to be patient. I'm confident that you'll land this big one. Frank and Joe were more excited about the cat case than ever. With a quick goodbye to their mother and Aunt Gertrude, they hastened into their car and drove directly to Mr. Jefferson's place. Frank and Joe, the elderly gentleman exclaimed when he answered the doorbell. Nice to see you. Let me take your jackets. My housekeeper is still away. Come right in. I hope you are enjoying your trip. We're having a fine vacation, said Frank as they took seats. We wanted to ask you about a few things. Have you ever seen this fellow? Mr. Jefferson stared at it in perplexity. What in the world? He exclaimed. I've never seen such an individual. Did you take this photograph on Cabin Island? Yes, sir, Joe replied, and explained about the camera with the telescopic lens. The Hardys also told how they had observed Hanley examining the fireplace and of overhearing Ike and Tad's conversation in the boathouse. Well, the police informed me it was he who broke into my house, Mr. Jefferson said indignantly. The rascal, he should be punished. The boys promised to do their utmost to apprehend him, and Frank told Mr. Jefferson of finding the carved ice boat. Their host's voice trembled with excitement. Johnny used to make ice boat models, he exclaimed. Uh-oh, Joe said sheepishly. Frank, I forgot to bring the model. It's still on the mantel. I must see it, Mr. Jefferson said. Can you come to the island with us? Frank asked. By all means. The three set off in the convertible for the boathouse. When he saw the Seagull, Mr. Jefferson looked apprehensive. I've never been in one of these contraptions. I understand they move rather swiftly. We'll put a rope seat belt on you, and we'll be careful, Joe assured him. He gave the elderly gentleman a spare helmet and goggles from the boathouse and helped him aboard. After a few moments of uneasiness at the speed of the Seagull and the nearness of the ice which flew beneath them, Mr. Jefferson appeared to relax and enjoy his ride. By the time they swept up to Cabin Island, he was almost enthusiastic. I've never made better time in a motorboat, he laughed. When the three entered the cabin, Frank introduced Chet and Biff. Mr. Jefferson took a long, slow look around the room, then spotted the carved ice boat on the mantel. At once he hurried over to see it. Johnny made this, he said with certainty, lifting the boat and running his fingers over its polished surface. I'm convinced he did this carving recently. It's by far his finest. Did Johnny teach himself woodworking? Chet asked in admiration. Yes, Mr. Jefferson replied proudly. The boy became intrigued with ice boats when he was very small. He used to spend hours watching them on the bay and frequently went to the local boat shop to see how the ice boats were made. Johnny would come home and carve until late at night. Next, the Hardys showed Mr. Jefferson the notebook containing the mysterious code and explained how they had found it. The man studied the book, shaking his head in amazement. This is the first I've heard of Sparewell in 2 years, he declared. The cipher is a complete puzzle to me, but the book is exactly like him, methodical to the last detail. Why would Sparewell make a map of Cabin Island? Frank queried. I can't imagine what interest he might have had in the island. With a sigh, the old man pushed the book away. I'm weary, he said. I better return. Once more the Hardys and Mr. Jefferson set off in the Seagull toward Bayport. Suddenly Joe shouted, Look out! Frank glanced about and saw another ice boat skimming straight for them. Its two occupants wore woolen face masks, giving them a grotesque appearance. With swift teamwork, the Hardys swung the Seagull out of the collision path. Oh, it's the Hawk, Joe gasped. Mr. Jefferson gave a hoarse cry. Here they come again. As the other ice boat swooped alongside, one of the men lifted a short, stout log from his lap and hurled it at the speeding Seagull. Thud! It was a square hit on the bow. With a sickening swerve, the Seagull capsized. The temporary seatbelts gave way. The Hardys and their passenger were flung across the ice. No, poor old Mr. Jefferson.